Hi everyone and welcome. We're in my wormery and I've got some food on the table and I'm preparing to feed some of my bins. This bin here, February 26th, it's 132 days old. And this bin over here is 103 days old, with these two bins down here clocking in at 66 days old now. This bin is actually kind of approaching what I've calculated to be my average bin age, which is somewhere in the 150 day range, somewhere between 140 150 days. So the fact that this is 132 days old at this point means I really want to try to make some efforts to get it closer to the completion of composting, so that I can really harvest the compost inside of the bin and migrate and move the worms into a new fresh bin. What I'm going to actually be trying to do today with these two older bins is to try to see if I can start dwindling down the food supply, just to make sure that the food supply in the feeding zone is still actively being replenished, but not in such great amounts. Because what I'd really like to do is try to work that down to where there's virtually no food in there, hopefully making it easy to harvest. So I've got an idea for that. So why don't we get these bins onto the table and we'll get to work on them. I think we'll start with these oldest bins first to take a stab at. We'll first inspect how things are coming along, and then to see if we could start applying my idea for getting these ready for harvesting. Okay, so we're seeing what we normally see in my bins, which is little sprouts trying to pop out everywhere. These must be cantaloupe, just based on the seed. But these cantaloupes are going to become worm food, so I'm just going to add them to the food supply over here. The feeding zone marker, so it must be this piece of paper right here. So as far as I'm concerned, that's no feeding zone marker anymore. It started out as a coffee filter, but it's pretty much history at this point. So I'll go ahead and I'll grab a new feeding zone indicator. Here we go, nice new coffee filter for that purpose. I'll set it aside over here. But we'll just go ahead and we'll blend in this piece of scrap into the feeding zone. So this has been the feeding zone here, even though the indicator is very small. This is the feeding zone. It's pretty obvious too, just based on the appearance of the material. It's damp, a lot of fine castings on the surface, and I guess, like I said, I'm going to try to start winding this bin down so that hopefully it can be harvested in the next couple of weeks. So my idea for that was to collect all the small scraps of food that are lingering on the top of the surface here. So I'm going to first do that, is I'm going to try to scrape together everything that's kind of just hovering out here on the surface, all the small pieces of food items, and kind of gather them into one spot so that I can dump them down into the feeding zone. And as far as the feeding zone is concerned, I wanted to try feeding it with some sort of a counterintuitive thought process here, but since we all know that certain food objects like corn just seem to take forever and ever for the worms to break it down, I figured it might be the ideal type of food with which to feed the worm towards the feeding zone towards the very end. Because if it comes time to harvest the material in the bin, then it'll just be a matter of removing the corn cob that's not yet been fully broken down, instead of trying to fish out all kinds of little bits of uneaten food. So that was my idea, was to use corn cobs to try to replenish the food supply in these near finished tubs, and with any luck they'll focus on getting a lot of these uncomposted bits worked down, and they'll have this as continued food supply. But when it comes time to harvest, it should be easier, hopefully, to fish out any uncomposted food items, because they'll just be this one item here, this uncomposted corn cob. Now we're going to peel back the castings. Stuff is pretty much compost only at this point. There's very little signs of anything. I assume that as we work our way down to get closer to the feeding zone, we're going to find more and more materials that might still be remnants of the last feeding, which was 10 days ago at this point. So I left a little bit more time this go around, in the hopes that they might work the food supply down a little bit more than they normally do when I feed every 7 or so days. I figured if I wait 10 days, then maybe they will have depleted the food supplies a bit more. So now these two oldest bins of mine did have bedding added in the form of newspaper. So that's the other thing I'm curious of, is to see how much, if any, of that newspaper still remains. Because if it does, then that will remain down in the food, in the feeding zone as bedding. And you know what? Now that I'm talking about it, I remember now. One of the bins did have a piece of newspaper added as its bedding last go around. But the other one, it appeared that the newspaper had already been consumed. So that was actually replenished with leaves. So I can't remember which this bin was, whether this was the bin that received leaves as bedding under the food, or if it was the one that received the newspaper. It might be the bin that received leaves, because I'm seeing some small scraps of stuff here and there, but nothing that would seem to, yeah, see, here's some uncomposted leaves. This must have been the bin that received the leaves as bedding under the food. And I must say, there's not a great deal of it remaining here. There's little food scraps. This seems to be the stem of a banana. I guess after 10 days, you probably shouldn't expect to find much. This is probably like some sort of a chestnut or some sort of a nut that's taking longer to break down. Put this here as well. I'm going to take all those sort of little scraps of food and little scraps of remaining bedding that I find and put them back into the feeding zone, along with a couple new food items. There's another banana stem, I believe. Yeah, this is breaking down really nice. I mean, any little lingering stuff that I can sort of retrieve and recycle back into the feeding zone, I'm doing so, but it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of it. A little bit of leafy material here and there, but that's going to be gone in no time. It'll probably get gobbled up eventually just by being out in the material on its own. I do want to include a little bit of quicker composting food too. So it's not going to be only this, it's not going to be just this corn cob. Well, you know what? Let's take a look at how much this rehashed stuff off the surface amounts to here. This looks like a piece that just ain't going to make it, but we'll keep it in here for now. Some more of this stuff that was picked up off the surface. Yeah, not a whole lot. So you know what? Why don't we just go with that for the most part? This should all still be more or less edible material for them. We'll give them one fresh piece of food right there. And, you know, just to keep the appeal of it up, the appeal of it, get it? Just to make it appealing for them, we'll put some banana peels in here as well. All right, that was a pretty lame joke. But why don't we treat that as our feeding zone now? I have a little bit of coffee grinds here as well that we can include in the feeding zone, because I've got a fair supply of that remaining here. Throw a little bit of that around the corn. All right, so here too, I guess if we find any other little food scraps, here's another banana peel, banana stem. Here's some more leaves. I would think that in here we're going to find a few more traces of some of the food that was part of their last feeding, but I'm not really finding a great deal of it, so I'm not going to sweat it. Like I said, if I stumble on anything larger, I'll make sure it's all the way on the edge with the rest of the food items, but I'm not really sensing that there's much of that here at all. All right, so let's go ahead and start leveling things off here. I guess it's mostly coffee on the edge, so I don't know if it's necessary to cover it up too much. But if it was a sort of food item that the insects are really attracted to, then I would worry about covering it up more. But I think since it's just coffee grinds, it shouldn't become a big draw for any sort of pests, so it shouldn't really be a problem if I don't go crazy covering it up. I think I did cover it up for the most part, but it's probably not necessary to go crazy with it. The one thing that's not really happening is that, you know, there do seem to be as many worms on this side as there are over in the feeding zone. So I'm questioning whether the horizontal migration is really a good means to an end in terms of rounding up a lot of worms to be to be separated from the compost. So we'll keep an eye on that going forward. Maybe if I keep dwindling the food supply, and you know, at some point maybe there's just still little scraps of food for them out on this end that they're being drawn to. Maybe if that stuff eventually gets all broken down and they run out of food supply over on this edge, maybe they'll start making their way over to the other end. You know, I don't know. Yeah, worst comes to worst, if I've got to do sort of a light harvesting, which is something I try to shy away from anymore if possible, then we'll do that, you know. But I think it's time to move on to the next bin. Oh, let's get the feeding zone marker on there. Okay, so this is the second bin that I would like to start gearing up for harvesting soon. This one too, geez, I don't know what's going on. My feeding zone marker filter paper has just been decimated, just like in the other bin. I don't know why that's happening. Alright, so I think the last one took a little while because I was sort of making it up as I went along. I didn't come at it with a direct strategy in mind, but I like the approach we used on that one, which was to try to gather as much of the uncomposted materials off the top of the surface so as to place it down into the feeding zone on the other side. And then we'll just use a piece of corn and any other uncomposted materials or uncomposted bedding we find to lay down the feeding zone. Try to keep encouraging the worms to finish off this material and make their way over into the feeding zone, if at all possible. Like I said, the last one seemed to be set up with a fair amount of leaves in the feeding zone as bedding. So unless they've gobbled it all up, chances are we're going to find a crumbled up newspaper in the feeding zone on this one. And, like we did in the other one too, I'm just taking any larger chunks of uncomposted food that I encounter, and I'm just setting them down into this pile of stuff that we collected off the top of the surface so we can try to use that as the material to load into the feeding zone. And try to leave what else is in the bin elsewhere throughout as just castings if possible, or at least to the best of our ability. It does seem like what we're finding for the most part is castings only. So as we kind of inspect the old feeding zone, let's see what we wind up with here. Yeah, okay. So this was kind of what I thought we would see here, was the remains of the newspaper that we had placed in here as the bedding. The reason we had done this was because we did the same with the previous bin that we just fed. But in that bin, for whatever reason, the newspaper just got gobbled up, 1, 2, 3. It's definitely lasting a lot longer here in this bin. So I'm not sure why. Maybe this bin just isn't as active. Maybe there aren't as many worms. It's hard to say why. But I'm going to try to fish out as much of this paper as I can so as to recycle it as bedding in the feeding zone. Get it back out here to the edge. Right. And here's another hunk of it. It's quite a bit. It almost makes me wish I had fed this bin first and maybe even used part of this newspaper as bedding in the bin that we just fed. And maybe that's something I can do next time, is I'll go in the other order. I can feed the newer bins first, and I'll get to this bin ahead of the other oldest bin. And if I do encounter large chunks of lingering newspaper that have not yet been broken down, I can maybe extract a portion of it to use it as bedding to feed with, to feed the oldest of the bins. Maybe it'll get eaten up more quickly in that other bin. Alright, so besides newspaper, I'm not really noticing any other food items from the last feeding. A little piece of asparagus. Maybe they're not that fond of asparagus. I guess when I give them asparagus and banana peel, I'm imagining they're going for the banana peel first. Just like a little kid would, right? Alright. I think that's a fair effort to put in, as far as I could tell. So why don't we kind of squash this bedding down, flatten it out a little bit, just so we can grab this old material that we scraped off the top and concentrate it all down here in the feeding zone. So hopefully it gets the attention it deserves, instead of just being scattered across the top of the surface. Getting visited once in a while, it should be right in the thick of the action as far as where the feedings are occurring in this bin. Alright, so I guess in keeping with what we had done previously, why don't we give it another corn on the cob piece, as well as a little bit of savory sweet banana. Keep the interest level up, and top it off with some used coffee grinds. That should do quite nicely. Okay, and we'll level it all back off again like we always do, or at least to the best of our ability. And maybe even cover up a little bit. Don't want to leave any of that corn or banana peel out on the top. Make sure we avoid attracting any pests. But this one's looking pretty decent as well. I like it. Good deal. Just curious now, since we normally check on the opposite side of the feeding zone, just to see how things are progressing. It's been about a month since we switched back. You know, we started feeding on this zone initially. Then about a month ago or so, we switched back to we switched directions to start feeding on the other side. And I always expect that the old feeding zone is going to remain interesting to them for a while, because there might still be lingering bits of food over there. But after a month, you know, you would kind of hope that, you know, without any food being applied to this end, that it would kind of get worked down to being compost only after a while. But it's still pretty heavily populated over here, just like on the other bin. Alright, so let's get on to feeding the two newer of the bins, which are the 66-day-old bins. They were both launched on the same day, so we'll Alright, so now on this one, kind of a similar deal, but still more intact than the other two were. Feeding zone indicator is pretty tattered, but I think we can continue to use it a little longer while it's still somewhat recognizable as a coffee filter. So we're going to knock out these little seedlings. Just can't seem to resist growing in my vermicompost. And here we've got a feeding zone that's down the middle. Let's peel back whatever's here and prepare for an updated feeding. You know, it's something that we had done a while back, which was to extract a lot of slow composting food items from the older bins and place them into these bins. And it's for that reason we're going to find stuff like corn cobs and mango seeds in abundance in these bins, because we did deliberately move those slow composting items over into these two newest bins. So we'll do what we always do. We'll just take those older food elements out as we encounter them and move them off to the sides. And we'll reintroduce them into the feeding zone when we're ready to do so. It is nice to see that a lot of this stuff is really breaking down considerably. You know, look at this mango seed. Normally you wouldn't be able to do that with a mango seed. Those things are tough as hell. Corn cobs too. Corn cobs really seem to take forever, but a lot of them are really starting to get whittled down nicely in size, so they're getting reduced down to much less. Eventually they'll just break apart in your hands and the little individual kernel pieces will scatter about and become just more easily eaten bits of food everywhere. But for now they're still kind of holding together as complete cobs. Alright. I am seeing little traces of what we had laid in here as bedding last go around, which was leaves. And most of the leafy material is gone, but all these little sticks, the little stems of each leaf are still abundant within the feeding zone. So those will eventually go as well. They're just a little bit tougher to eat than the leafy, soft part of the leaf. But why don't we do what we had done previously? We're going to throw a little bit more bedding down into here in the form of more leaves, because they really seem to like the leaves. And then we'll add a fresh feeding. Okay, so pretty generous amount of leaves as bedding down into the middle here. So we'll take all these older, slow composting food items and return them down into the hole. Here's the cork. The cork, which just never seems to get consumed, and we always keep bumping into it, but we never see any progress on it. I think one of these days it might just get removed because it doesn't seem to be a compostable item, or at least not an item that's going to get composted very quickly. It almost seems like it's a shame to keep it around. This is an item that I was tracking for quite a while originally, and I'd almost lost track of it or lost sight of it, but I was just reminded of it. This was the pumpkin stem. This was the stem of the pumpkin that was in the time lapse from 6 months ago or so. Oh, I just broke it in half. Now I wonder if I'll recognize it next time I stumble on it. While it was still whole and it still had that star shape, I definitely recognized it as what it is, but at this point it might be a goner. It might be the last time we see it. That was interesting. I almost forgot all about that. It's pretty cool. Alright, so now, since this bin is a little bit newer and there's a fair amount of time left as far as I'm concerned, I'm going ahead and feeding a lot more generously. Not going to try to use that strategy as we used on the two older bins. And you know what? What the heck? Put a fresh piece of corn cob in this one as well. Not much coffee grind left. Save a little bit of coffee grind for the last bin as well. Alright, let's get this bin covered up as well. And while we're at it, we'll go ahead and we'll scoop out to the edge so we can get a peek at how things are happening on the edge. Maybe even feel a large piece that belongs down in the middle while we're at it. Okay, not bad. Yeah, lots of worms all over the place on the edge as well. So I don't seem to get the kind of focus I hope for by having like specific feeding zone. It just seems like I've got worms scattered all over my bins for some reason. Next time we come visit this bin, it'll be depressed right in the middle where the food is anyway, so that's what always happens. There's always a distinct, clear depression to show the void created by the food being depleted. So, alright, let's get this up on the shelf. I'll cover it up later. We'll get to the last feeding right away. Okay, so now out comes bin number 2 from May 3rd. And once again, we're going to uproot all these little sprouts, turn them into food for the next feeding. And, you know, I'm not sure what's causing it. The coffee filters I use for marking the feeding zone just seem to get clobbered lately. I think this might be a little portion of what was in here previously as the feeding zone indicator, so we'll just give this one a nice fresh one. Once again, we're feeding down the middle, and this is more or less set up the same way as the last bin we just fed, so we should find more traces of old slow composting food bits in here, such as this half of a mango seed. Traces from the last feeding, such as this banana peel handle or stem. I don't know why I call it a handle. So let's pile a little bit of compost up here on this side first. Just some loose compost, and then we can start taking some of these old slow composting items and pile them up here so we can return them to the feeding zone when we're done checking things out. So yeah, here's another mango seed that's not yet been infiltrated. Every time I encounter one, I try to see if I can, give it a little squeeze to maybe crack open the shell, but sometimes it's still too fresh for that to happen. Or maybe I'm just too weak. More mango, more corn cob. Really hear them moving around. Here's another one just started getting opened up, but you can see they've climbed their way in there and they're just going bananas eating that eating the inside of that shell. Must be really nutritious stuff in there. I mean, other than those couple stems from the banana, I didn't really see many other old pieces of food. Here's another stem. The peels themselves get gobbled up 1, 2, 3 it seems. It's just the stems take a little bit longer for them to work down. So down here, once again, we're seeing the telltale signs of the bedding that we used previously, which was leaves. The little stems of each leaf, where the leafy material has all been gobbled up, but the little stem of it still remains. Takes a little bit longer for them to eat it. So we'll just do the same. We're going to lay down a little bit of bedding in here first, and then we'll restore the food and add some more. Nice active bin. Very nice for a 2-month-old bin. Very active, very healthy. I'm just wondering if going forward I'll feed many more corn cobs or mango seeds, just that they take so darn long. Okay, let's put in, I guess, what remains of my supply of leaves. It's pretty much what we started with in the other one, about the same amount, I would say. We can start laying in the old food articles. Alright, there we go. That should help. Next time we encounter this seed, it's now been cracked open so they can gain access. I'm sure it's going to be a popular item pretty quick. We'll put it right in the middle. Not that it's going to help me remember to check on it. It'll just it'll just be in the middle. Very nice. Okay, let's get the remainder of the food that we have set aside for them into the bin. Mostly banana peels this go around, and coffee. Used coffee grinds. Let's see if we can break some of this apart here. This was that dragon fruit. This is, I guess, the outer shell of it. Some of the more meaty inner pieces were fed in other feedings, but this is, I guess, the bulk of, I don't know, the fruit or whatever it is, the shell or the skin. Okay, nice generous feeding, and we'll deplete what remains of our coffee grinds. Okay, looking pretty good in here. Let's get everything covered up and back up on the shelf. All right, everyone. Well, somehow I'm getting the sense that this is going to be a fairly long video. I just look at the clock on the video camera every now and then, and I'm always surprised at how much time has elapsed since I hit record. Because it just, I don't know, how do I say? I mean, time flies. I mean, it is kind of fun playing with these things, and especially when you don't really come at it with a set game plan. You're sort of making up as you go along, and you're just assessing things on the fly and trying new things, coming up with new ideas. It's just sort of a nice, relaxing way to kill some time sometimes. Why don't we call it a day? We pretty much accomplished what we were after today. We'll get the feeding zone marker back on here and the bins covered up, but that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. And also consider subscribing, becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's always very much appreciated as well. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Take care, everyone. Thanks for watching. Bye.